This is Nan McKay, and I would like to introduce you today to Craig Saddlemire. Craig is a co-founder and longtime resident of Raise-Op Housing Cooperative. He began his role as manager in 2015, in which he implements policy created by residents of the Raise-Op, including its growth and also its development. So previously, Craig operated a small business producing documentaries and educational videos about social justice issues in Maine. He also served on the Lewiston City Council and volunteered for organizations advancing issues of housing justice and public transportation. So welcome, Craig Saddlemire.
Thank you, Nan, very much for having me.
Now, Craig, you are speaking at the Solutions Summit for Housing Crisis next week, and you're talking about working with low-income tenants to become cooperative owners of apartment buildings. What's it like to do community housing work in a small, rural, post-industrial city like Lewiston? And how does that differ from perhaps the housing work in large metropolitan areas?
I think there's a number of similarities, but also a number of important differences that seem to surface, particularly when I'm talking with folks doing similar, housing work in large cities. A key one, I think, is that we have a lot of old housing, and a lot of it has been with deferred maintenance, with lead hazards, with other dangers, particularly in our neighborhoods where predominantly low-income people live. Furthermore, we don't have much of a housing development industry. Most of our affordable housing developers are concentrated in Portland, Maine, and it sort of thins out from there. So if you're not right in the center of Portland, our biggest city, affordable housing developers are few and far between. We also have a labor shortage. And in some communities, at least when we started doing our work with the Raise-Op, we had a high degree of vacancy in a lot of abandoned properties. And the reason I think that's an important part of our story and why our circumstance might differ from other groups trying to do similar work in major cities is that we had a lot of empty buildings that didn't cost much money to acquire. And there wasn't much competition as far as affordable housing developers go for some of the federal resources to improve these properties. So we were able to, as a small, community group with a lot of passion, but not a lot of experience for housing development, we're able to actually get some buildings and fix them up and make them occupied by cooperative owners and start to develop our skills, our knowledge of how housing development works, and grow in a truly grassroots way. And what we see in very big cities is not that this is impossible. We never dissuade anyone from trying that. But when you have these firmly established, very large development organizations, it's hard for grassroots groups to be given a chance when there's already these, direct tracks for the big groups to get the money and do the work, because that's what the cities are most comfortable with.
Now, how big is Lewiston?
Lewiston is about 37,000 people.
Okay. And I tend to think of cooperatives more in the bigger cities, and yet this is a co-op in a small city. Is that kind of more East Coast, or is it pretty prevalent around?
We're the only urban multi-unit housing cooperative of our kind in the state. And there are housing co-ops of all different kinds and sizes across the country. I think housing co-ops in New York City and in Quebec, and as well as in California, are maybe some of the more well-known ones. And they're used to provide all different types of housing. Some housing cooperatives are not affordable in any way. In fact, unfortunately, some housing co-ops are used to really restrict who has access to the housing there. But use the right way, housing can be a very empowering opportunity to provide affordable housing to a diverse group of people. And that's how we use it here.
Is there much difference in managing a co-op in a smaller area versus a larger city?
Well, I haven't managed a housing co-op in a larger city myself. I mean, we are a small project, and I think that is different. The economics are different. Our buildings our smallest apartment buildings are 3 units, and our largest apartment buildings are 9. We have 3 buildings total. We have 50 residents in all of our homes, and we have 15 cooperative members who own the organization. And I think a lot of housing developers would tell you that you reach a good economy of scale when you can do a 40-unit building or bigger, and below 40 units, the economics of it just get a bit tougher. And so we're very much a scrappy resident-run organization. And while there are maybe from a cash flow perspective some more challenges with operating small properties occupied by people with not a lot of money, it's also a much more intimate setting, and it gives the residents an opportunity to truly know all of their neighbors, and work together, and maybe not get as lost as one might in a much larger development. That, I mean, if you're going to have a 40-unit building, you probably are contracting for professional management or bringing in folks from the outside. But all of our staff live in our properties. That's not actually a condition of being a staff person, but our employees do live in our buildings, and it's entirely member run. And I think our size just lends itself to a certain intimacy that would be harder with a bigger project that you'd likely see in a bigger city.
So tell me the difference between a co-op and a condo.
In a condominium, typically the condo owner owns their unit. They often say, from the walls in. And there's a condominium association that will control some of the common properties like the lawn and driveway or things like that. And there are still, dues that condo owner may have to the association. In a housing cooperative, typically the ownership is simply a share, one or more shares of stock in the corporation. So residents own shares of stock. That reflects their ownership interest. And then they are still leasing or renting their unit from the corporation. So the group has a bit more power compared to a condo, because it's a lease arrangement and not the individual's name is not on the title to their unit. It's just all of the property is simply owned by the corporation. And then from there, I mean, more typically housing co-ops, though not by definition, but more typically housing co-ops are more mission oriented than a condominium association. Ours certainly is. We participate in a lot of community development efforts. We always have intentions to continue to grow, to continue to provide greater opportunity for cooperative homeownership to our neighbors. And you find that a condo association could do that, but that's not typically in their purview.
So are you a big fan of co-ops?
I'm a huge fan of co-ops. I didn't really know much about them before I started doing this work. I was a renter, and I was living in a building that the developer had promoted as going to convert to a housing co-op, and they were not successful. But that was where I first was introduced to the concept. My friends and I said, actually, we would really, if it's not going to happen here, we'd like to start our own housing co-op somewhere. And so we went on to do that. That was in 2008. But that was when I was first exposed to the concept of cooperatives. And, there's many different kinds beyond housing. There's worker cooperatives, there's consumer cooperatives, and blends of both. And a cooperative economy, I think, would do us much better as a society if we had more businesses that were cooperatively owned by the people most impacted by them.
So in order to convert to a cooperative, it seems like you would have to get all of the residents to agree, and then you form a separate corporation. Is that how it works?
Yeah, it can happen a number of different ways. Well, I guess as an aside, in Maine, the fastest growing form of housing cooperative is actually manufactured home parks. And New Hampshire's been a big leader in that as well. And those are a bit easier to convert in the sense that there's less to share. People own their manufactured home typically, and what they're leasing is just the land. And they might have a lot of homes on a single piece of land. They negotiate with the owner, and then they cooperatively own the land and continue to lease that. But how they take care of their individual homes is up to them. In an apartment building, it's a bit more complex because you're sharing the heating expenses and the property tax and insurance and just all kinds of other stuff that impacts the project. So to remind me of your question.
Well, I'm also wondering, it was kind of how you put it all.
Oh, how you do it, how you convert, yeah. Right.
Yeah. But I'm also wondering whether this tends to solve part of the problem of the affordable housing crisis, and if so, how?
Yeah, well, so there's a few different ways, to start a housing co-op. And one way could be that you've got folks in a building that ideally all of them, or at least at least 80% of them, want to start a housing co-op, and then they get organized, probably with some amount of outside consulting help, organizing support. They form the corporation. They become shareholding members of that corporation, and then they buy their building. And this is another instance, I think, where in our community, most of the buildings that people live in, not all of them, but most of them are not buildings that I would recommend they become owners of. A lot of the buildings in this community, because they've been neglected for so long, because they have so many hazards to them, I think they're very much liabilities that a group of low-income people, if they could successfully negotiate a contract to buy it, would not really be set up very well for success. And that's one of the big challenges we face today compared to 12 years ago when we began, is there was a high vacancy rate when we started. Today, most units are fully occupied. We have a very tight rental market. And so now it makes it a bit harder to do the same kind of development we did before, because the buildings aren't safe, and so they need to be renovated. And if they're going to be renovated safely, people need a place to go, but the rental market's full. So it's a bit tougher. We're starting to look at new construction now. But to finally finish answering your question, so yeah, you get a group of residents together that are in a building. If the building is worth purchasing, and it will be, of value to them to control it, then they form in Maine, we have a special statute for it. It's called a Cooperative Affordable Housing Corporation. They form the corporation, they become shareholding members, and then the corporation purchases the building and they lease it and to themselves and operate it from there. But the other way is to get an empty building and renovate it and then bring people into the co-op, not based on where they live, but just based on their interest in cooperative living. And that's how most of our members in our co-op have joined, because we were able to get primarily empty buildings. The last building that we got was 6 of the units were occupied and 3 of them were empty. We invited all of the members to join, but the landlord that was selling was not interested in us talking to the tenants before the purchase. So it was a tricky situation where we bought it and then we explained what a housing co-op was and gave them, yeah, right, exactly. And gave them, a long period of time to decide whether they wanted to stay and become members. And they all decided to do that. So, we got through it, and the building required substantial renovations, and we were kind of playing a checkers game in terms of renovating an empty unit and then shuffling a group into that unit and then renovating the one that they vacated. But it was challenging. It's not an ideal way to renovate a building, because as it turns out, all of the systems are connected together. So when you're trying to renovate a plumbing system, you can't just do it one unit at a time as well as you'd like to.
True. So in your talk, is there anything that you're pointing out specifically other than simply that this is a very good option for a lot of people for housing?
Yeah, I think it's an important tool that folks interested in housing justice and affordable housing work should be thinking about. What my talk is going to focus on is more of the specifics of our history and our story, and really how cooperative housing is about resident empowerment, which I think is really key to what makes us successful and what really sets cooperative housing apart from a lot of other housing types, is that it can really be a vehicle to empower folks who are often marginalized and disempowered by the housing market, and by the community at large. And it can also be a vehicle not just for empowering those residents, but for broader social change. That's how we view our organization, and we think it's led to a fair bit of success. So we share our story, but we also think it's equally important to share the context of where our work happens, because the context matters a lot. And I think what we do is replicable, but it's important to understand the community in which our work happens, because adjustments need to be made for other communities where that work is going to happen.
And it sounds like you have a passion for social justice. Is that pretty true?
Yeah, it's very true. And as you mentioned, video work is what I did professionally for 10 years before becoming the manager of the co-op. I used to document a lot of the poor housing conditions in my community, and a lot of the activist efforts and organizing efforts to change that. And while I think the storytelling and journalism are very important parts of education and information exchange and ultimately social change, it wasn't feeling like enough. And the first iteration of the housing co-op that we started in 2008 was more for self-interested reasons. It was myself and 3 friends. We just wanted our own affordable place to live that we could call home and customize to meet our needs, where I still live today. And so I was doing that. As a volunteer, I was a part of housing justice work in the community. And a lot of folks knew of us as the only housing co-op in town and in the state, and said, we'd like to be a part of that. Are you guys going to grow? And the answer for a while was no, we don't have the capacity to grow this thing. And after making enough videos about the problem and about possible solutions, it felt like I really wanted to, with a group of other community leaders that were interested, work on expanding this model and trying to really be a part of that change in as direct a way as possible, instead of just telling stories about it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that, Craig, because I think it's helpful for people to know that there are alternatives, and then how to go about those alternatives is an important point as well. And you've done both of those for us. So thank you. And we wish you a lot of luck and success in what you're doing.
Great. Thank you for having me.